Chapter 1. The Word Burden. I never expected my own son-in-law to call me a burden. Not knowing the land he mocked me for owning was the only thing keeping his collapsing company alive. The bank called me behind his back, begging for my confirmation. His CFO warned me he had falsified numbers, and the man who once laughed at my age showed up at my door shaking, calling me Nom for the first time in years, pleading for my signature to save everything. My name is Marjorie Lane, and before I signed anything, I made him sign something far more important: the conditions that would flip our entire family's power dynamic forever. And if you want to know how a quiet grandmother became the one person he could not live without, we need to go back to the night he said the one word that changed everything. To understand how it all unfolded, let me take you back to that evening. I was wiping down the edge of Claire's kitchen counter when I felt Darren's eyes on me. The Saturday sun was pouring through the blinds in their Dallas home, warming the tile floors and making the place feel gentler than it really was. Claire was rinsing dishes. Evan was humming to himself while building a tower of plastic blocks. Everything looked ordinary, but I had lived long enough to know when a storm was sitting in a room pretending to be quiet. Darren let out a short sigh. It was meant to sound careless, but it landed with weight. He said that a woman my age should not be living alone anymore. He followed it with a sentence that slid under my skin even though his tone was flat. He said that someone my age would eventually become a burden to Claire. The word settled in my chest like a bruise. Claire froze with her hands under the faucet. Evan looked up at me with wide, curious eyes and asked if I was tired again. I smiled and shook my head because he did not deserve to carry even a piece of the heaviness that had just filled the room. Claire tried to soften the moment by brushing past Darren and gathering Evan's blocks, but her shoulders were tight. I could see her deciding whether to speak up or let it pass like she had so many times before. Darren did not notice, or he pretended not to. I told them I should get going. I reached for my coat draped over the dining chair and slipped my arms through the sleeves. Claire followed me to the door, apologizing without words, her face pale and tight with conflict. I touched her hand lightly and told her everything was fine. It was the kind of lie mothers tell to keep their daughters standing upright. As I stepped outside onto the front porch, I heard Darren's voice drift after me through the barely closed door. He said that they could not keep taking care of me forever and that Claire needed to be more realistic. His voice was low but clear enough that he knew someone could hear. Maybe he even wanted me to. The wind felt colder when it brushed against my arms. I walked down their driveway slowly, letting each step steady me. I had been talked down to before. Age has a way of making some people think wisdom and worth fade at the same pace as eyesight. But something in Darren's tone that day was different. It was not annoyance or carelessness. It was calculation, a belief that I was already 1 foot into dependency, a belief that I did not matter. The drive back to my place in North Dallas was quiet. I let the radio stay off. The city passed by in afternoon light, familiar streets dotted with restaurants, repair shops, and the storage facility that sat on the same lot my husband and I had invested in back in 1994. The land had been our first big leap of faith together. He had been so proud when the long-term lease renewed in 2020. Sometimes I still heard his voice when I drove near it. When I reached home, I checked my mailbox before going inside. A thick white envelope from Lone Star Community Bank sat on top of a stack of flyers. I carried everything to the kitchen counter, made myself a small cup of coffee, and opened the envelope. Inside was a formal request from the bank. They needed confirmation from all listed owners of the land parcel on Preston Road because the property was being used in a refinancing application for Weston Build Co. They needed my verification as a co-owner still living at the registered address. For a moment, I simply stood still. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the sink ticked. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street. The quiet of the house wrapped around me the way a heavy blanket might settle over someone who has just heard a truth that reshapes everything they thought they knew. Darren had no idea my name was still on that deed. He had no idea that the land he was leaning on to save his company was protected by a clause my husband insisted we include nearly 30 years earlier. Darren had spoken of me as if I was already a weight hung around his neck, yet here I was, holding the letter that proved the opposite. I set the papers on the table and rested my fingertips on them. I felt the steadiness of something shifting inside me, a slow, quiet realization. Darren believed he understood exactly who I was in the story of his life. A fading character, a harmless inconvenience, someone he could push aside whenever he needed space to stretch his ego. But he had misread the plot. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I turned off the kitchen light and walked to the living room, letting the late afternoon sun fall across the wooden floor. For the first time in a long time, I felt no hurry to act and no pressure to react. I simply let myself breathe. The situation was already moving toward me. All I had to do was wait for it to arrive.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 2. Fault Lines. The next morning, the air in Dallas felt strangely heavy, the kind of heaviness that comes before a storm you cannot quite see yet. I tried to keep my routine the same, a short walk, a quiet breakfast, a cup of coffee on the porch, but my mind kept circling back to that envelope from the bank. I had not told Claire about it yet. I wanted to understand what Darren was doing before involving her. Later that afternoon, Claire called. Her voice was calm, the way someone sounds when they have practiced holding themselves together. She said she and Darren had another argument over bills and that he had snapped about how expensive everything was. She said he had accused her of wasting money on groceries, even though she handled the budget carefully. She paused and then admitted that he had been hiding overdue notices in his office drawer. I could hear the defeat in her breathing. I asked her if she had considered counseling. That was when she hesitated and confessed she had already spoken privately with a marriage therapist named Jenna Ross. Jenna had told her Darren displayed patterns of financial control and emotional pressure. Hearing that tightened something in my chest, a mix of worry and quiet anger. I told her I was glad she had reached out to someone. The following weekend, they invited me for lunch again. I almost declined, but decided the more I saw for myself, the better. When I walked into their kitchen, Darren was already irritated. He was pacing with his phone in his hand and tapping his fingers against the counter. He said the bank was being ridiculous and dragging their feet over what he called an outdated property file. He muttered that the owner who originally signed it had passed away years ago and that no one should still be tied to something that old. I asked what property he was talking about. He stopped mid-step and looked at me. He said it was a commercial lot in Plano that his company had been using as collateral for refinancing. Then he shrugged and said the bank kept insisting the old deed needed a supplemental signature because some secondary co-owner had never been formally removed. He waved it off and said that person must be dead or unreachable. He added in an annoyed tone that no one would leave their name on a deed for 30 years without updating anything. My heart beat a little harder, but I kept my voice steady. I asked him if he was certain there was only one name on that file. He scoffed and said he was not going to waste time chasing ghosts, and that if the co-owner still existed, the bank would have found them already. He picked up a plate of grilled chicken and carried it to the table, as if the conversation no longer mattered. The rest of the meal was quiet. Evan chattered about school and dinosaurs. Claire tried to stay cheerful, but I saw her watching Darren, gauging every shift in his mood. It was the kind of vigilance women learn when they have lived too long with someone who might boil over at any moment. I left after dessert, giving Claire a small squeeze on the arm that meant I was here and that she was not imagining the weight she carried. When I got home, the sky was beginning to darken. I set my purse on the armchair and was about to call the bank when my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously.
The voice on the other end was polite and firm. He introduced himself as Harold Kears, a senior loan officer from Lone Star Community Bank. He asked if I had received their letter about the commercial parcel on Preston Road. I told him I had. He explained that Weston Build Co. had applied for refinancing and that the bank could not move forward until every legal owner of the collateralized property verified the deed. He said plainly that without my confirmation, the loan would not be approved and the application would expire within a few weeks. I listened without interrupting. Hearing it laid out so simply made the situation feel even sharper. Harold went on to say that this kind of issue was common with older investments where ownership had not been updated after a spouse passed away. He spoke respectfully about my husband, saying he remembered conducting a few transactions with him years ago. His tone made me feel seen in a way Darren never bothered to. After I thanked Harold and ended the call, I stood in the middle of my living room, letting the silence stretch. Darren was out there building arguments, blaming the bank, blaming paperwork, blaming anything except the truth. And the truth was that he needed something only I could give, and he did not even know it. I pulled out a folder from the cabinet near the hallway. Inside was the original deed my husband and I signed in the 90s, carefully preserved. I traced my finger over our names. The clause granting equal authority to both owners was still there. My husband had insisted on it so that we would always share power no matter the circumstance. I had forgotten how seriously he took that idea. I felt something steady me from the inside, a reminder that I didn't have to shrink to fit the role Darren believed I should play. Later that evening, I called my old friend Linda Greer, who had become a respected real estate attorney over the last 30 years. When she picked up, I could hear the rustle of papers and the muffled sounds of her office. I told her about Darren's situation. She listened carefully, then said she wanted to review the refinancing documents herself. She told me to send her scans of everything from the bank. I could hear the frown in her voice when she said it sounded like Darren might be leaving out more than he was admitting. I emailed her the documents, and she called back an hour later. She said the clause in my deed gave me full veto authority on any refinancing involving that property. She also pointed out inconsistencies in the financial projections Darren submitted to the bank. Linda advised me not to sign anything until we met in person. She said manipulating financial documents for refinancing is risky and could backfire badly on everyone involved. When we finally ended the call, I turned off the lights in the kitchen and let the house fall quiet. I walked to the window and watched the lights of passing cars blur slightly through the glass. I felt no rush, no panic, only a grounded understanding that I had far more leverage in this story than Darren could imagine. A shift had already begun. I could feel it, steady as a heartbeat, waiting for its next step.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 3. The Signature He Couldn't Replace. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my doorbell ringing twice in a row, urgent and too early for a friendly visit. I slipped on my robe and hurried down the hall. When I opened the door, Darren was standing on my porch, holding a white bakery box like it was a peace offering he barely remembered how to give. His smile was stretched too wide and too quick, the kind that never reaches the eyes. He said, "Morning, Mom. Thought I would bring you something fresh." Mom, a word he had not used for me in years. Hearing it now felt like a prop placed awkwardly in the wrong scene. I stepped back and let him inside. He scanned my living room as if searching for signs of weakness or loneliness he could use. His energy was jittery, unsteady, the way people get when they are trapped but still pretending they have options. Before I could say anything, my phone buzzed. It was Claire. She whispered, "Mom, he left the house in a panic. Please do not sign anything. I mean it, not yet." I whispered back that I understood and told her I was fine. When I hung up, Darren was already opening the bakery box on my table like we were settling in for a cozy breakfast I had never agreed to. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Good news," he said. "We can wrap this whole thing up today. The bank just needs your signature. It is a simple formality." He pushed the documents toward me. The pages slid across my table like a quiet threat. I sat down and picked up the first sheet. "What exactly am I signing?"
I asked. His smile flickered. Just a confirmation of ownership, standard stuff. You do not need to worry about the rest. It is all technical. I kept flipping through the documents. Cash flow projections, asset declarations, debt schedules, numbers that did not match the patterns I had seen companies hold to when they were healthy. Darren, I said softly, your liabilities are higher than your liquid assets by a wide margin. Why does this sheet say the opposite? He blinked too fast. Mom, you are not in finance. You would not understand how these things are structured. Please do not make this harder than it needs to be. I am under a lot of pressure, and this is the last thing we should be debating. I looked up at him and saw irritation slip through the cracks of his performance. The bakery box sat open between us, untouched, a ridiculous symbol of his failed attempt at charm. You called me a burden last week, and now you need me to save your company? His jaw tightened. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his voice rose just enough to reveal the truth under every word he had spoken to me for years. If you do not sign, we lose everything. Claire loses her security. Evan loses his stability. Is that what you want? Are you willing to let your grandson suffer because you refuse to help? There it was, the familiar tactic. Push the blame onto the person he wanted to control. I placed the papers down slowly. I want to understand why Weston Build Co. collapses the moment I say no. He stepped closer, his hands flat on the table. Because that is how business works. I do not have time for a lecture. The bank will pull the refinance and the entire structure falls apart. Do you really want that on your conscience? I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to believe he had cornered me. Then I turned to the deed papers I had set aside the night before. Linda went through the contract with me, I said. He jerked his head up. Linda who? Linda Greer. She reminded me of a clause your application seems to ignore. I opened the deed to the page that my husband had insisted we include so many years ago. This clause gives each owner full veto authority on any refinancing or restructuring involving the property, which means I do not sign, I decide. The change in his expression was instant. His confidence cracked like thin ice. What are you talking about? He said. The bank said this was clean. They said the co-owner was a formality. I am the co-owner, and I am not a formality. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat tightening. You cannot block this. You do not understand what's at stake. If this refinance stalls, the company goes under, and that will be on you. My phone buzzed again. Claire. I answered without taking my eyes off Darren. Mom, are you sure everything is all right? I can come over right now if you want. Her voice was worried but steady, and it anchored me in a way Darren never could. I'm all right, honey, I said. I'll call you soon. When I hung up, Darren was already desperate. What did you tell her? Did you tell her you're thinking of killing this deal? Do you know what that would do to us? No, I said, but I think you do. He leaned back, shaky, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw him understand the limits of his control. He had pushed me into a corner he thought was mine, not realizing he had stepped directly into his own. I stood up and gathered the papers into a neat stack. I will not sign today. The next time we talk about this, Claire needs to be present. He stared at me as if trying to decide whether anger or panic would serve him better. Neither worked. In the end, he picked up his briefcase without touching the pastries he brought and walked to the door with the stiffness of a man who had just discovered the ground beneath him was not solid. He paused for a second, maybe expecting me to change my mind or soften my voice. I did not. He left without another word. When the house fell quiet again, I let myself breathe. The air felt different now, not heavy, but open. The balance had shifted, and Darren knew it, and for the first time in a long while, he understood that I was not a woman he could move like a pawn on his board.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 4. Terms and Conditions. The next day, Claire showed up at my door with her shoulders drawn tight, the way people carry themselves when they have been holding too much for too long. I let her in, and she sank onto my couch without taking off her coat. Her eyes were tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. She said, "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I do not want you to think less of me." I sat beside her and waited. Darren has been controlling all our accounts. I have no access to anything without asking him. He tells me it is easier that way, but Jenna said that is a form of financial control and that it is one of the signs I should not ignore anymore. Hearing her say it aloud made something inside me ache. Claire had always been gentle by nature, and women like her often end up explaining away behavior that should never be explained. I asked her what Jenna had told her. She said Darren uses pressure and guilt the same way some people use anger. She said I keep shrinking myself to make him feel bigger. I'm starting to feel like I do not recognize my own life. I reached for her hand. Your father always wanted you to stand tall. He believed in building a foundation that would last long after we were gone. That is why he kept our names on that land. He wanted to make sure you always had something that could not be taken from you. She looked at me, startled. I did not know the land was still in your name. I thought Dad had sold it or given it to the company years ago. No, I said. We kept it, on purpose. And now it is the reason you and I have a say in something Darren cannot control. For the first time in months, I saw a spark in her expression, a quiet recognition that she was not powerless. My phone rattled on the coffee table. It was Harold from the bank. He said, "Mrs. Lane, I'm sorry to bother you again, but the refinance deadline is approaching. If we do not receive your confirmation soon, the file will be closed." I told him I understood. His tone carried a pressure he was trying to soften but could not fully hide. Not long after Harold hung up, I received a second call from an unknown number. It was a man with a steady voice who introduced himself as Troy Miller, the CFO at Weston Build Co. He said he was calling unofficially because he was worried. "Mrs. Lane, I know we haven't met, but your daughter speaks kindly of you. I thought you should know the documents Darren submitted to the bank were altered. The numbers." Chapter 4. Terms and Conditions. The next day, Claire showed up at my door with her shoulders drawn tight, the way people carry themselves when they have been holding too much for too long. I let her in, and she sank onto my couch without taking off her coat. Her eyes were tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. She said, "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I do not want you to think less of me." I sat beside her and waited. Darren has been controlling all our accounts. I have no access to anything without asking him. He tells me it is easier that way, but Jenna said that is a form of financial control and that it is one of the signs I should not ignore anymore. Hearing her say it aloud made something inside me ache. Claire had always been gentle by nature, and women like her often end up explaining away behavior that should never be explained. I asked her what Jenna had told her. She said Darren uses pressure and guilt the same way some people use anger. She said I keep shrinking myself to make him feel bigger. I'm starting to feel like I do not recognize my own life. I reached for her hand. Your father always wanted you to stand tall. He believed in building a foundation that would last long after we were gone. That is why he kept our names on that land. He wanted to make sure you always had something that could not be taken from you. She looked at me, startled. I did not know the land was still in your name. I thought Dad had sold it or given it to the company years ago. No, I said. We kept it, on purpose. And now it is the reason you and I have a say in something Darren cannot control. For the first time in months, I saw a spark in her expression, a quiet recognition that she was not powerless. My phone rattled on the coffee table. It was Harold from the bank. He said, "Mrs. Lane, I'm sorry to bother you again, but the refinance deadline is approaching. If we do not receive your confirmation soon, the file will be closed." I told him I understood. His tone carried a pressure he was trying to soften but could not fully hide. Not long after Harold hung up, I received a second call from an unknown number. It was a man with a steady voice who introduced himself as Troy Miller, the CFO at Weston Build Co. He said he was calling unofficially because he was worried. "Mrs. Lane, I know we haven't met, but your daughter speaks kindly of you. I thought you should know the documents Darren submitted to the bank were altered. The numbers do not match our internal reports. If this refinance fails, a lot of our employees might lose their jobs." He apologized for putting me in a difficult position. I thanked him for his honesty. When we ended the call, I felt the air shift again, heavier and clearer at the same time. Later that evening, I opened my email and found a message from Darren. It read, "If you really care about Claire, you know what you need to do. We cannot afford delays. I assume you will make the right choice." There was no threat in the words, but the intent was unmistakable. It was the same tone he had used to chip away at Claire piece by piece. I closed my laptop and sat still until my breath evened out. Fear and anger were both there, but neither were in control. I believed for the first time that what I did next could change more than a loan. It could change the shape of our family. The next morning, I called Darren and told him to meet me at a small coffee shop on Greenville Avenue, a place my husband and I had visited back when we were young and hopeful and saving every cent to buy that piece of land. The cafe had old wooden tables and the same faint smell of roasted beans that never quite left the walls. Darren arrived 10 minutes late, flustered but trying to mask it with confidence. He sat down across from me and spread the documents out again. He said, "We're almost out of time. The bank needs that signature today. If you want to help your daughter, you will sign now. This is not complicated." I stirred my coffee slowly and looked at him. "Darren, you cannot use Claire or Evan to pressure me." His jaw tightened. "I'm not pressuring you. I'm telling you the truth. They will suffer if this company collapses." I placed my hand lightly on the top page and met his eyes. "You have made choices that led to this moment. I am not here to rescue you from the consequences of those choices." He leaned forward and lowered his voice. "What do you want from me? Money, a favor, my gratitude? Say it and let us get this done." I let out a quiet breath. "What I want is for my daughter and grandson to live in a home where fear is not the loudest voice." He looked confused for a second, then impatient. "We do not have time for philosophy. Either sign or tell me what you want in exchange." I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder Linda had prepared. Inside were 3 documents, each written in clear language, each tied to a boundary Darren had crossed long ago. I slid the folder to him. "These are my terms." He opened the first page and frowned as he read. "Claire gets full access to our accounts and approval rights on major decisions." The second sheet. "I have to attend a management and behavioral program for 12 weeks? Are you serious?" The third. He read it slowly, his face coloring. "I have to sign a respect agreement. You want me to promise not to call you weak or old or a burden?" I nodded. "I want you to acknowledge the harm you cause when you weaponize those words, and I want you to stop." He looked at the 3 papers as if they were burning his hands. "You expect me to agree to all this just to get a signature from you?" I kept my voice calm. "I expect you to understand that your behavior has consequences. If you want my signature, you will sign those first." For a long moment, he stayed perfectly still. His pride was fighting his desperation, and desperation was winning. He signed each page with rough, irritated strokes. Then he pushed them toward me. "There, you got what you wanted." I took the refinance papers, opened to the signature line, and signed with a steady hand. The ink settled onto the page like the final piece of a puzzle. I texted a scan of the signed document to Harold. He replied almost instantly, confirming the bank would process it immediately.
Darren sat stiffly across from me, swallowing whatever rage he dared not show. I gathered my things, stood up, and placed a few dollars on the table for my coffee. As I walked out, I felt a kind of quiet strength settle through me, a reminder of my husband and the wisdom he had carried so naturally. Outside, the air felt clearer than it had in weeks. The path ahead was opening. I could almost feel the next turn arising to meet me.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 5. When Karma Signs Back. The following week moved faster than I expected. Harold called to confirm the refinance had been approved, but there was a note in his voice that told me something else was unfolding behind the scenes. By Tuesday morning, news reached me through Claire, who had finally been granted access to all of their household accounts. The bank had launched an internal audit on Weston Build Co. after noticing irregularities in the financial data Darren had submitted. Claire sounded shaken, not because she was surprised, but because she finally had proof of the feeling she had carried for years. She said, "Mom, I found withdrawals I never knew about, thousands over the past year. He told me we were cutting back because times were hard, but he was draining our emergency savings without saying a word." I heard papers rustling as she searched through printouts. "There are credit card charges I cannot tie to anything, travel expenses, purchases that do not match our statements. I think he has been hiding this a long time." I let her speak until her voice steadied. It was not anger that held her now, but clarity. The kind of clarity a person gets when the fog finally lifts and they see the road they have been walking on. By Thursday, the board members at Weston Build Co. requested Darren attend a meeting to address the inconsistencies. I was not there in person, but Troy called afterward. His voice carried the tone of a man relieved and disappointed at the same time. He said, "It all came out. The projections he sent the bank were altered. The debt schedule was off by almost 20%. The board decided he will stay on, but under full financial supervision. He is not allowed to make any unilateral decisions anymore." Losing autonomy cut deeper for Darren than losing money ever could. That evening, Claire asked me to come over. When I arrived, she and Darren were sitting in the living room. The room felt smaller than usual, the kind of small that happens when truth fills every corner and leaves no space for pretending. Claire looked at her husband first. She said, "You owe my mother an apology, not because she helped your company survive, though she did. You owe her an apology because you treated her as if she was in your way, when she was the only person holding us together." Darren stared at the floor. His hands were clasped tightly, his knuckles pale. "I know I went too far," he said quietly. "I should not have spoken to you the way I did. I should not have put this on you. I am sorry, Marjorie." It was the first time he had ever said my name without impatience clinging to the edges. I nodded. "It matters that you said it, but the rest of it, Darren, will be proven by what you do next, not what you say tonight." Evan came into the room holding a drawing he had been working on. When he saw me, his face brightened. He ran over and pressed himself against me in a hug that was warm and certain. He said, "I know you're not a burden, Grandma. Dad said something mean, but Mom said it was wrong. I know you help us." The innocence in his voice softened something in me. Some wounds close slower than others, but his words stitched one of mine a little tighter. Later, Claire walked me to the porch. The night air held a faint coolness that hinted at the end of summer. She stood beside me for a long moment before speaking. "Mom, I feel like I can breathe for the first time in years. I don't know what happens next, but I know I'm not going to live the way I was living. Jenna said understanding the truth is the first step. You gave me the rest." I touched her cheek. "You did that yourself. I only reminded you of your strength." In the days that followed, Weston Build Co. stabilized, not because of Darren, but because the board finally saw the truth Troy had been carrying alone. Systems were reorganized, finances were monitored closely, and Darren had to attend the 12-week program he had signed into under the pressure of his own desperation. Every condition he had agreed to became a mirror he could not avoid.
Claire kept her access to their accounts and began managing their budget with quiet authority. She stopped apologizing for asking questions and stopped shrinking every time Darren raised his voice. He raised it less often now, maybe because he was learning, maybe because he finally understood that his world no longer revolved around the illusion that he was the only one steering it. As for me, I spent a quiet morning visiting the land my husband and I had purchased so many years ago. The lot looked the same as it always had, unremarkable to most people, but to me it held the weight of every choice that had brought me to this moment. My husband had once told me that true power often lies in knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. I had not understood that fully until now. I sat in my car for a while before heading home. The sun was beginning to dip low, brushing the buildings with soft gold. It felt like a closing note, the kind that settles at the end of a long story. I thought about Darren, about Claire, about Evan, and about the way life has a habit of teaching lessons in unexpected ways. I had not shouted or threatened or tried to break anyone. I had simply held my ground, used the truth I already had, and waited for the moment when it could not be ignored. Sometimes revenge is not an explosion. Sometimes it's a steady, quiet signature placed exactly where it belongs. If you have ever been treated as if your worth had an expiration date, or spoken to as though you took up too much space, I hope this story reminds you that your value is not determined by the people who underestimate you. If it resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts, your own experiences, or what parts stayed with you. Your voice matters here, and I would love for you to stay connected as we continue exploring stories of strength and quiet power.